morning, everyone. Thanks so much for spending the next hour also with me and my colleagues who are waiting in the wings. Today is a lecture recital which is part of my degree here at UBC. I'm a DMA student, that means Doctor of Musical Arts, which means essentially that in addition to writing a thesis, I also have to play a bunch of recitals, and today's recital marks the final one of these. And it won't be a normal recital. Instead, I will also be sharing a few insights from my research, my thesis project, as well as other research projects that feed into it. I want to extend a big thank you to Green College for hosting this event. I've been a resident member here throughout my degree, and I couldn't have asked for a better place to call my Canadian home. And especially big thank you to Gratian, Heather, Ihome, Emma, who's not here today, and so many others, Seon, behind the cameras. I so appreciate all your support. I'll have to run back and forth here for the slides. Preparing for today, I was reminded that events like these are usually started with a land acknowledgement. And as someone who didn't grow up here, I have at times struggled to perceive these as more than just hackneyed phrases that are being recited out of a sense of obligation, I think. For the first time that it took on deeper meaning for me personally was after an event where an Indigenous artist had performed a welcome song, and talking to them afterwards, they told me about the tradition that this welcome song came from, and noted though that the big difference is that back in the day they could have chosen not to welcome someone as well. And as an international student, I had to jump through some hoops to get here. Like any modern nation state, Canada reserves the right to refuse entry to those they deem not fitting certain criteria. But talking to this artist, it became suddenly viscerally tangible for me that those whose, as it is said, ancestral and unceded territory this is, they were not granted this right of refusal. Before talking too much more, I want to play some music. After all, it is a recital. All the pieces today are by Canadian composer Eleanor Dunsmuir, who lived around the turn of the 19th to 20th century. I'm very excited to say that the foremost expert on the history of the Dunsmuir family is among us today. I hope you don't mind me calling you out. Jenny Seaman is the archivist of Craigdarroch Castle in Victoria, which was the family home of the Dunsmuirs. I will tell you more about this composer and my research in a bit, but for now I would like to invite my fellow musicians to join me on stage. Domagoj Ivanovic on first violin, David Lakirovic second violin, Jakob van der Sloot viola, and Eva Lakirovic cello, and importantly Shani Cohen, who will later perform some Dunsmuir songs with me, has kindly agreed to take on the most stressful job of all, which is to turn pages. Please help me welcome them. While my colleagues set up, a few words about the quartet we're about to play. Dunsmuir titled it Fantasy, which usually means that the composer wants to unshackle themselves from formal expectations. And indeed, unlike your standard chamber music piece, this fantasy only has one movement. Also, the key of A major is only used tangentially, really, in the beginning and the end, but otherwise Dunsmuir strays quite far from the tonic center, very much in keeping with the developments of the 20th century. a little stage maintenance is happening. I want to quickly introduce you to Dansmur, the person, before then talk more about my actual thesis research. Eleanor Dansmur was born just outside of Nanaimo in 1887, the fifth child of James and Laura Dansmur, and her father served as premier and lieutenant governor of the area, and Eleanor's early years were spent sort of the way you would expect for a member of the upper echelons of society. She performed in local events, salons, and some theater productions. Jenny can tell you all my mistakes after the event. Eventually, she went to Europe, where she would stay for 2 decades, and this is where she really deepened her engagement and study of music, and especially also composition, and she would only occasionally visit Canada. As some of you have heard me say, I believe it is high time that Dansmur is recognized as Canada's queer icon of classical music. She did little to hide that she was gay, never marrying, and found traveling oftentimes with various female companions. Her surviving library also shows that she actively engaged with contemporary research and discussions on early sexology, or what we would nowadays call gender and queer studies. Dansmur's surviving oeuvre is extensive. Among her compositions are several ballet scores and operas. In the 1920s, she pitched a ballet to Sergei Diaghilev. That was her ballet. The Sphinx. Diaghilev was the founder of the Ballet Russe, unfortunately to no avail. It was eventually performed in Monte Carlo. She was indeed a very versatile composer. She also wrote for Broadway. The 1928 musical Sunny Days featured some of her songs. Yet somehow it always seemed like she never got that breakthrough. Dansmur eventually returned to Canada. Her return was preceded by an incident in Monte Carlo. She was rather infamous for gambling, so much so that one of her colossal losses, which I think amounted to 10 million francs, was reported in the newspapers, and according to the article, Dansmur's quote, friends asked her to forsake the game and devote herself to composing. Eventually cut off by her family and having lost a fortune, she came back to BC and spent the final almost decade of her life there. I already mentioned her extensive repertoire. Here's a selection of her compositions in various genres. To the right, the table holds some of the compositions that we have complete scores of. However, if we want to look at all the archival materials available, here is a spreadsheet I created after camping out in Jenny's office for a few days earlier this year and going through all the boxes with scores of Dansmur's music. And I created this spreadsheet with detailed descriptions of all the scores that are still available. And I mean, given this substantial oeuvre and this substantial body of work of this composer that wrote, as I believe, very attractive music, you may ask yourself, how come, okay, it keeps going. How come you live in Canada and presumably have never heard of Dansmur? My own thinking in creating my DMA thesis project was similar. I previously spent many years researching European women composers of the 18th and 19th centuries, and there were many of them. The concerning thing to me was that unlike common narratives of historical dismissal, many of them were actually celebrated during that time, especially in the 18th century. Composers like Mariana Martinez, pictured here, were literally lauded for their musical genius. So how come they were erased from history, excluded from the canon, and completely overshadowed by the so-called genius composers we celebrate today. Essays such as that by Linda Nochlin discuss, quote, why there were no great women artists, as she put it. The underlying insidious assumption being that, quote, there have been no great women artists because women are incapable of greatness. Nochlin details the structural, institutional, and societal inequalities that kept and keep women from being educated equally and that block their professional development. She also adds that exception to these rules, which of course exist, individual great women do not disprove the blanket discrimination. Many have used the exceptional circumstances of individual successful women artists as reasons to dismiss their and others' work. Martinez was an aristocrat and a self-proclaimed dilettante, or Alma Mahler, who is remembered as a muse rather than as a composer, and of course the all-powerful and quite snarky, there's probably a reason why they aren't performed. Nochlin approaches this differently and asks instead how our conditioning and our consciousness shapes and falsifies how we pose these fundamental questions, such as why are there no great women artists, and the so-called woman problem, the question of women, quelle est les femmes. In this essay, they propose that women and their situation in the arts are not to be viewed through the eyes of the dominant male power elite, at whose will or whose whim their demands may possibly someday be answered at masculine convenience, of course. Women must conceive of themselves as potentially, if not actually, equal subjects willing to look the facts of the situation as an institutional and objective problem, not merely as a personal and subjective one, full in the face, without self-pity or cop-outs. I would add to this discussion by saying that the archival work, or lack thereof, on women composers further hinders our understanding of our actual past. Going into archives, it becomes quickly apparent that women were involved in all aspects of music production pretty much throughout history. However, archives, not Craig Darab-Custom, did not do a great job preserving their work and memory, and even if they did, most of it has not been studied sufficiently. My worry in starting my current project at UBC was that what I had been seeing in the archives, the erasure of women from history, would happen again. Anecdotally, I think many of us are probably aware of at least a few women composers that are being performed. If you turn on Radio 3 in the UK or whatever the Canadian equivalent is, they do play the odd woman composer here and there. Yet looking at statistics, the number of performances of works by women composers by major orchestras has actually declined in the most recent years. And that number wasn't particularly large to begin with. My motivation for working on contemporary composers in Canada, especially women composers and members of the Association of Canadian Women Composers, was thus twofold. For one, I see a need to perform, study, and preserve the work and legacies of women composers today. The amount of times I wished I could have talked to Martinez when I was researching her life and music. And with contemporary composers, it's still possible, yet too few people do it. Too few people take the time to go to talk to them and try to understand their work, their music, their motivation, save for a select few so-called mainstream classical composers of the 21st century, maybe. The other thing I wanted to find out what it means for women to be composers nowadays. What does it mean to do a job that is built on a legacy of white, male, European genius? And what if you're none of those? While the interviews for my sociological study here were all anonymous, I also produced a podcast series with a select few ACWC composers. You can see the thumbnail here, All of the episodes are available on YouTube and Spotify. Regarding this last point, what happens, oh, I think there was one too many. What happens when there's an absence of an established legacy, or if one does not find oneself represented in this legacy? Marcia Citron added thoughtful commentary in her book, Gender and the Musical Canon. She wrote, "The presence of a past can go a long way toward assuaging creative anxiety, but which past does the female creator relate to? Some neutral or universal past, a male past, or a female past? Perhaps she might want to relate to more than one tradition. But if one of them is a female tradition, the problem is that there is still no fully formed female tradition to relate to. Music by women is performed occasionally, but still has not acquired the status of a meaningful tradition." Before I go into much more detail on my project with ACWC composers, I would like to invite Shani Cohen back on stage. We will be performing 2 songs by Eleanor Dunsmuir. The first one called Somebody and Nobody, and interestingly it includes an inscription in Dunsmuir's own hand beneath the title. In the place where the lyricist is usually written, Dunsmuir wrote text by somebody, and where the composer's name is usually placed on a sheet of music, she wrote music by nobody. This ironic and self-aware commentary on authorship and recognition raises the question, what does it mean to produce sophisticated musical works and yet remain effectively invisible? The second song is equally interesting. It uses a text that Dunsmuir noted as being by Sappho. I believe it is more likely attributed to Sappho. However, Dunsmuir obviously chose it very intentionally, which is what matters from a historiographic standpoint. Shani, may I ask you to join me?
Somebody entered and stole my heart. No
my sociological study, which makes up the main body of my GMA thesis, consisted of 21 interviews with members of the ACWC or composers who are somehow associated with the ACWC. Every interview lasted between 1 and 2 hours, and the ages of composers ranged from late 20s to mid 80s. The composers described their musical upbringing in these interviews, their pathways of becoming composers, which often also included grappling with the historically charged concept of what it means to be a composer. They ranged from some who solely worked as composers and made their living exclusively from commissions, and others who wear many different times and write music whenever they have time to do so. One of the core principles of the ACWC as an organization appears to be to highlight the work of composers regardless of how quote-unquote successful a composer is, meaning they seem to wish to deconstruct this modern belief that in order to be a successful composer, one has to only be a composer. Even though historically that was never the case, all of the famous composers that we know today were wearing many different hats too. Most of them performed, most of them taught, yet somehow today this double standard exists where composers are supposed to only compose to be successful. One thing that many interviews shared, especially those of the older generation, was that the early display of talent was often dismissed or belittled and often not recognized at all. Especially compositional talent was not something that was fostered. If anything, their abilities as performers were highlighted more so, but creativity, compositional creativity that was expressed was not something that was being seen as such by their circles and the people around them. One composer put it like this: they said, there was no such thing as encouraging anyone to be a composer or teaching children to compose little tunes. And every composer I knew in books or in music I was learning was male from Europe. Women composers didn't exist. What we see in this comment and numerous other experiences that were shared by composers I talked to is kind of a hangover of German 19th century romanticism and subsequent historiography. With the project of canonization, the creation of these imagined legacies and lineages among especially Germanic composers in the 19th century, women simply didn't make the cut. This German romanticism enshrined conditions for so-called musical genius, which included the ideals of artistic autonomy, originality, and uniqueness, as well as seemingly obligatory suffering and sacrifice and separation from ordinary life, along with a strong preference for youthful brilliance while simultaneously demanding aged maturity. While most participants rejected the notion of genius, they were split on approaches to composing. Some still clung to this notion that becoming a composer, there must be a special spark that you have, and composition ultimately can't be taught. Others rejected and worked against that idea actively and said they didn't want to just do find your voice composing, and instead insisted that for everything you want to do, there's technique that you can learn and that can be helpful to express what you wish to say. At the same time, the way many of them spoke about composing, regardless of their stance of the former, they spoke about it as a fundamental necessity and an inner urge, which very much remains coded within the German Romantic framework. One composer literally said, "I learned that I need to compose to stay alive," which sounds really melodramatic, I know, but I used to think Rilke was being super melodramatic. The letters to a young poet where he says, like, don't become a poet unless you will die if you don't become a poet. I used to think that's so stupid, what are you talking about? But that's actually kind of true. I realized that I don't really want to be alive if I'm not composing. Maybe not healthy, but that's the way it is. This is an interesting example how the cognitive and conceptual framework of being a composer is delineated by language and rhetoric tropes available to us. Another fascinating aspect that many composers highlighted was the importance of community and shared creativity in the creative process. This, of course, is directly oppositional to the solitary genius trope that music history has perpetuated. Rather than working in isolation, participants describe creativity as emerging through relationships, collaboration, and shared practices. Several of the interviews mentioned how community gave them courage and confidence, including the confidence to call themselves a composer, where they previously maybe felt not creative enough or something similar. The ACWC as an institution was highlighted by several of them as existing somewhat outside the norms of this field, as a space for mutual support and encouragement. One composer put it very pointedly, saying, "I don't really like composers. We have a lot of neurotic narcissism." There can be kind of a competitive vibe. Even really lovely women composers can be bothered if someone seems to be winning too many prizes. But women composers are better than men composers for the most part. The ACWC is nice because it gives a chance to be supportive and not competitive, which is how I prefer to be relating to other composers. Let's finally return to Eleanor Dunsmuir. We have one more quintet, this one in F minor. Like the previous one, the F minor quintet is really only one key that is at the very opening and end of the piece, and therefore we somewhat unhelpfully term it as being in F minor. Dunsmuir was very much in tune with the times, using and exploring extended harmonies. One of her songs that we heard earlier, Somebody and Nobody, is a great example too. The song is only 8 bars long, as you see here, yet it includes a key change halfway through. Here we get the key signature change. The opening key is E flat major, but it is never really established. Those of you who know how to read music may see the pedal point in the left hand of the piano and think, oh, there's an E flat, but that's quite deceptive. The melody of the singer has very little to do with E flat major, as I'm sure Shani can tell you all about. And then halfway through, we get the switch to the key signature of G major. But this too is not really achieved until the very last bar, when for the first time in the entire piece we get a proper triad in G major, highlighted here in blue. The F minor quintet is of course much longer than this little song, and it spends a lot of time in E major, which is quite far, relatively far away from F minor, but it is a leading, E is the leading tone to F, so there is a certain hierarchical relationship, if you will, or at least the keys are seen as somewhat equal. Interestingly, the manuscript of the quintet bears an inscription to this effect on the title page. The inscription appears to add or equate the key signatures of A flat and E major. If taken literally, the combination of these two keys and key signatures yields a collection of 11 distinct pitch classes, lacking only D natural, unless we are also counting the melodic minor of F minor, which includes the D natural, which then means we have all 12 pitch classes, so all 12 chromatic notes in an octave. It appears Dunsmuir was trying to maximize pitch resources this way, while still somehow retaining a residual tonal framework. I would go even so far as to say that Dunsmuir was perhaps experimenting with a form of proto-polytonality, even if it is quite different from polytonal practices of other early 20th century composers. She seems to be integrating these pitch collections into a fluid harmonic language in which tonal references coexist without necessarily being fully established. This quintet, as I said, is also a single movement piece, though it is somewhat divided into a three-part structure with a slow, lento opening, a slightly more forward-moving main body of the piece, and then again a lento at the end that I envision as a kind of march, funeral march, if you will. Please help me in welcoming my colleagues back on stage. much to my incredible colleagues for going on this dance mule adventure with me. It was the first time for us to play this quintet today, and I'm pretty sure it has never been performed, at least not in the 21st century, and if dance mule performed it, it was likely not in a public concert. So in a way, we have experienced a sort of premiere today, which I'm very excited about. And for me, it was fascinating getting to know her music, camping out in Jenny's office and transcribing the handwritten manuscripts and getting to know dance mule's musical language. I'm not sure how we are on time. If we have a few minutes, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about dance mule, although maybe you want to direct them at Jenny, or about the ACWC and my research in general, the music. Not everyone all at once. Yeah, Jenny.
Sorry.
Oh, Jenny.
Okay, I'm so delighted that you're bringing Ella's music out and getting people to hear it, because I just think she deserves to be heard. I just wonder, as you were going through her music and transcribing it, I remember when you were in my office, we were finding those little hand-drawn images in there and little side notes in the marginalia. What do you think of her now? Like, you had that kind of basic first impression of her that we shared at the beginning of the project. How has your knowledge of her grown through this project?
That's a good question. To be honest, right from the get-go, when I came to your office, I thought this was really something. Like, you could see the quality of her work in the scores, and the archival materials are so interesting because for many pieces we have multiple different versions, and you can see the works evolving, and from sketches to clean pencil versions, and then the clean ink versions with some pencil corrections here and there. And I think there's a lot more to be done, to be honest. I've now done a few songs and chamber music, but she wrote so many large-scale works, which of course needs a lot more time and resources to go through all of those. There, I think it will be really fascinating to see that progression from first draft to final version, and it's such a gift that we have those. Now we just need the resources to study them. Yeah, Jaden.
I was really curious about your interviews. I'm sure when you went in, you had some ideas about what you wanted regarding creative negligence and women composers. But was there something that really surprised you when you were doing your interviews, or something that you heard that you really weren't expecting from one of the interviews?
Good question. I think maybe it wasn't a surprise, but what I found profoundly beautiful was the dedication of every single one of them to their craft, and regardless of whether they were composers who earned all their money with composing, or if they had a day job as a teacher and every couple of weeks they could scrunch away a couple of hours to write a piece. All of them were so incredibly invested in their craft and in composition, and to me that really spoke to a different kind of genius, if I can say that. The ultimate dedication to a kind of purist approach to the creative work that they were doing.
Hi, yeah, thanks very much. That was wonderful. You actually kind of touched on my question a little bit, but I was thinking a little bit of genius, just as a concept, coming from a romantic period where it seemed to pick out those who were kind of outside of the norm. I can't remember the slides exactly, but outside of the norm, working, they have some tradition, or they're a bit outside the tradition. And from your interviews, that seems to be eroded a bit, where these composers are talking more about the relations they have with their fellow composers, and maybe with some competition, not as much of a desire to kind of stand out and subvert the field or anything. Or maybe not the last one, but the question is kind of like, what work then is genius as a concept doing today, given its connection to the Romantic period? And is it still, what might you think still motivates even holding on to genius as a concept for composers?
Yeah, I think the thing is that composers don't hold on to this concept, but I think it still very much exists among, especially audiences, in our daily conversations. If we talk about music, or if you read concert programs, oftentimes it will be, oh, that genius musician, a child prodigy kind of composer here on stage, and celebrating it in that way. I mean, most of the composers I talked to very much rejected this notion, yet I don't think we are fully able to shake it, because even those who rejected the romantic stereotype of the genius composer who's somehow distancing themselves from normal life, I think we still have that hanging over us a little bit, because even if they weren't using the word genius, they were framing their work in terms of, oh, this is just something I need to do, it's an inner urge, it's my, and the sense of complete dedication, or trying to reach complete dedication, which of course realistically, materially is not possible for many, but it is, I think it is difficult to not be somehow in conversation with that concept doing that work, even if you are ultimately rejecting the notion that there is such a thing as genius, unless we're defining it as it should be, as something that is socially accumulated and constructed and historically built. Yeah, please.
How do you choose to study Dan Smith? Were there like other composers you considered?
There are probably many other composers, and I should say, it is maybe, I struggled a little bit creating the program for today, because I'm studying contemporary Canadian women composers, and there's over 100 members of the ACWC, and I invite you to look at their music. It's fantastic. They have SoundCloud, listening lists, sheet music, everything on their website. But it was an anonymous study, so I felt it was maybe problematic to then write the names on the program after I anonymized them in my study. Hence, I thought it would make sense to choose a relatively recent historical composer, and in classical music terms, 100 years is very young. So Dan Smith is essentially contemporary. Yeah, Rina?
Just picking up on the question of genius, it occurs to me that in every European language that I can think of, whether it's Romance or Germanic or Slavic, the word for genius is like roughly it's basically the same word. And it leads me to wonder if, to the extent that you've looked outside of sort of the Western canon and tradition of composing, if maybe that the grip of that notion of genius is not as present or as shared as it is on the continent.
That's an interesting question. I was very much focusing on contemporary classical music. A lot of the composers were also involved in other genres. I suppose especially those who came maybe from DIY music scenes or songwriting, they seem maybe a little less burdened with the historically charged concept of genius. And everything that comes with that, which is of course this sense of perfectionism and having an uninterrupted, ideally an uninterrupted career from child prodigy to rising young star, which again is just so much, statistically so much more difficult for women, especially the older women that I interviewed. Many of them had career breaks, but then found their way back to composition, which speaks again to what I was saying before, this sense of love and dedication to their craft, that even facing major obstacles and being alienated from the world of music by all kinds of horrible things, they still came back and reframed composition in a way that is sustainable for them to pursue. And part of that, I think, is also rethinking what it means to be a composer. Oh, Alana?
I love this. I loved actually hearing something that has never been heard, certainly not in this century. I find the question, what is missing, a really interesting question, because it's impossible to see what's missing, and that's what your entire work was about, who isn't heard or who is heard. I'm wondering if, as you've been investigating this, are there other things, other people, or other genres, or other things that are missing in the classical music canon that you're like, why is this not here? And only you have seen what's missing.
Oh, so many. Yeah, I mean, a lot of you know I've spent the last 5-ish years doing work on historical women composers, and Martinez was one I focused especially on, but in the process of researching her, I came across so many others, and without even trying. So I can only imagine what else is out there, and there is music out there that can be studied and played and performed, and I know it is a topic that it has been discussed a lot, and I don't know that I have a good answer to it, because I still enjoy listening to some nice Bach and Beethoven and all of that, but sometimes I'm also a little bored with it, and I think I would like the chance to get bored of Dunsmuir and the others. Yeah, Robert Calvin.
This is a pretty interdisciplinary collage we just saw. So down and dirty archiving, data entry, interviews, transcribing, like playing, organizing a recital. What was the most challenging part, and what was the part that brought you the most joy?
Oh, difficult question. Most challenging is this question. I think the most joy is probably the connection with the people, both the interviewees, but also the people I get to meet in an academic context that are outside of music, because I'm doing interdisciplinary work. 2 of my doctoral committee are here today, and I'm so grateful for their support, honestly. It's been such an incredible experience working with not musicians, but also I think the conversations that arise from this research. One of my dear piano teachers is here today as well, and I loved our conversations about the strange repertoire that I kept bringing to lessons, and then seeing people's curiosity and openness to exploring that with me. I think that is one of the best parts. Well, again, thank you everyone so much for being here. We have Green College has prepared a little drinks reception, so please stick around, and I'm so happy to see so many familiar faces. I want to talk to each and every one of you, so please have some drinks, have some nibbles, and enjoy yourself.